All right, everyone, we are now live on Facebook. Thank you so much for tuning in tonight. For those of you watching directly on Zoom through Eventbrite, thank you for pre-registering. And for those of you watching on Facebook, thank you so much for tuning in. We hope you'll pre-register for future events. Tonight, we have for you a great event. We have the Bruichladdich Know What's in Your Whiskey. So we have Jason from the brand here to talk to us about 4 different products and a little bit of brand history. We also have Patrick who works with Jason, excuse me. So him, Mark, and myself are here to answer any questions you may have. We're so excited to bring you this event as part of our 90 Days Around the World promotion. So if you haven't heard about this promotion, we are going to be going live 3, 4, 5 times a week from last week until January. We're going to be taking you around the world to meet some different brands. We're going to do some virtual tastings. We've got coupons, we've got giveaways, we've got famous winemakers, famous distillers, we've got it all. So check out 90daysaroundtheworld.com to learn more and find some events that you think you'll enjoy. So tonight we are going to virtually go to Scotland for a little tasting. And Jason, we're so excited. This is our first visit to Scotland as part of the 90 Days promo. So I'm going to let you take it away.
Thank you. Appreciate the introduction. Welcome, everybody. It seems lately that basically all the traveling we've been doing has been virtual, so this is no different. We are going to be spending some time in Scotland on the island of Isla, talking about Bruichladdich. So if you want to bear with me just one second, I'm going to share my screen so we can all follow along with the wonderful little picture book I put together. Great. Can everyone see that? Okay. So yeah, this is a picture of Bruichladdich seen from what's called across the loch, or what's called Loch and Dal. Now, Isla is a small island off the coast of Scotland, about 250 square miles, or 1/5 the size of Rhode Island. It's going to be the first bit of land you're going to hit if you head due east from Newfoundland. So it gets the full brunt of the Atlantic storms, that very kind of wild, maritime kind of environment, very much like the coastal New England. But it's a land of extremes, because you have this kind of wild maritime influence, but then you also have these kind of lush, fertile, green farmlands. You won't see a lot of trees on Isla. Reason being that was pretty much clear cut when the Romans came through a long time ago. So a lot of the much of the United Kingdom and Scotland, Ireland as well, has kind of gone to the earth for their fuel source, where we talk a lot about peat when we talk about Scotch whiskey, because peat has been the primary fuel source for most of Scottish history. Now, Isla, being as remote as it is, currently has the kind of reputation of being, wildly, individualist, kind of secluded from the rest of Scotland. It's a remote place, so they've kind of held on to this tradition of using peat. And so when we think of Isla, much of what we, the real whiskey nerds out there, they think of that smoky, peaty whiskey. But not all Scotch is peaty, and we're going to be talking a lot about the unpeated stuff. We do make heavily peated, and at Bruichladdich, we also make the world's most heavily peated whiskey. So you kind of get the full gamut there. Now, this is a view of the distillery in Loch and Dal. Again, if you were to look at the picture of the island, it's kind of like this upside down horseshoe, and the inside of that is Loch and Dal, and that's where Bruichladdich is, right across the loch from Beaumont, which is another very well known, and actually the oldest distillery on Isla. Now, Bruichladdich was originally founded in 1881, and it's the oldest commercial distillery on the island. Now, what I mean by that is this was built from the ground up, late 19th century, with cutting edge Victorian age technology, because it was the first legal distillery on the island. The distilleries before that were distilling illicitly, but then when the production, or excuse me, the sale of Scotch whiskey was legalized, the Harvey brothers, three brothers, went in to Isla and built this distillery on the hill overlooking the water. Now, the reason it was built into a hill was so they could use gravity to move the wash down through the stills. It was the first distillery to use concrete on the island to separate the means of production out into different buildings. So if you had some sort of fire or natural disaster, you didn't lose everything. It was very forward thinking at the time. But like any family business, when you have three brothers running the show, they falling in and out, not exactly the best businessmen there. So the place went out of business, some years later, and actually has gone in and out of business 4 times. So it spent a good amount of time actually mothballed. Now the upside of that is Bruichladdich never fully modernized. It never kind of went this factory distillation that the industry has gone. There's no computers there. There was never any kind of modern equipment brought in outside of what was originally brought there in 1881. So when we reopened this distillery in 2001, there was a couple of private investors, 2 wine merchants that had identified Bruichladdich as having the same kind of element of terroir, which we talk about a lot with wine, this kind of sense of place, that the flavors of the wine, or in this case the whiskey, are related to their source, either the source materials, the grapes when it comes to wine, or the barley when it comes to whiskey. But most importantly, the provenance, the soil type, the proximity to the ocean, the elevation. They identified Bruichladdich as having this kind of quality. It tasted like Isla. Again, that kind of green freshness, but then also a nice kind of salinity, that maritime influence. So they got together with Jim McEwen, who is a legend in the whiskey distilling industry, kind of like the Mick Jagger of whiskey, if you will, this larger-than-life rock star personality. He ran the Bowmore distillery for about 30 years, or worked there for 30 years, ended up as the production director at the end. He was going into retirement. Long story short, it was this kind of labor of love to get Jim involved to bring this distillery back online, because they saw it as being symbolic, for the way, for Isla itself. Isla is a small island, about 3,500 people, that used to have about 13,000 people living there about 100 years ago. Now, the reason the population was declining so much is because there's not a lot going on the island. You're either working in whiskey, you're working in whiskey tourism, or you're working in small local businesses. There's no Walmart, there's no McDonald's. As I said, it's very secluded. So as this industry became more modernized, more mechanized, you have less people involved because you have more computers making the whiskey, and then you start outsourcing, you start distilling on the island and then aging it on the mainland, because maybe you own multiple distilleries and it's easier logistically to centralize your aging. There became less jobs available, and then the young people that were going off to college just didn't come back because there's nothing for them at home. So reopening this distillery was a way to, as Jim saw it, to do whiskey the way he thought it should be done. Starting with Isla and ending on Isla, using Isla ingredients as much as possible. Of course, distilling on Isla, but most importantly, aging and bottling on Isla. Now, aging is hugely important. A lot of distillers will say anywhere from 60 to 80% of the flavor of their whiskey comes from the barrels itself, and the air surrounding those barrels while they're aging. The flavors in that air, whether it's in the highlands or closer to the ocean where you have that salinity in the air, influences the flavor of the whiskey. So if you've got an Isla whiskey that spends a week on Isla when it's born, and then spends 10, 15 years outside of Glasgow, you're not going to get that Isla terroir. Plus, there's a lot of money and a lot of jobs that are leaving Isla. So that was the focus for Jim, was doing whiskey, kind of this dream project for him, but also really using it as a way to give back to the community and to set an example for how he thought businesses should be, or more importantly, distilleries should be functioning on the island. So this is us now. From 2001, we relaunched the distillery. It's been updated. You see a lot of, they basically took the whole place apart, put it back together again. But you have this kind of very modern, stylistic approach to it. Everything from, the font, the text there, the color, even the color of the bottle. This very iconic aqua blue that you see that basically just kind of jumps out at you in the back bar and the liquor stores. It's a statement whiskey. And the statement we're making is really, we're trying to poke the bear here in the whiskey industry, where the focus is on really on the marketing campaigns behind a lot of whiskeys. As I mentioned, the whiskey is largely made by computers now. It's a guy on an iPad cranking out millions of liters of product, and they'll make the bottles look as old-fashioned as possible with these kind of ye old English fonts with a big number on the bottle. The bottles all look stylistically very similar, but the whiskey inside is very, how to put it, like almost homogenized. Like there's a standard of flavor and a production that a lot of distilleries adhere to. And as I mentioned, it's pretty much mass produced. So we're the flip side of that, if you will. We reopened with this focus on terroir, which means we're not processing anything. We're not chill filtering, which means you're stripping out a lot of the fatty acids, a lot of the sweetness coming from the malt sugar. We're not adding any caramel color to it, so it's all natural color from the casks. But most importantly, we're really kind of taking our time using this vintage Victorian age equipment that hasn't been updated. There's still no computers in the distillery outside of the gift shop in the accounting office. So doing whiskey as old-fashioned as possible, but with a very kind of modern branding or approach. If you're turned off for the color of the bottle, then so be it. We can't please everybody. But the idea being, especially with that opaque presentation, you can't see into it. It's not so much about what it looks like; it's about what it tastes like. So there's been a lot of things going on over the years. When we reopened this distillery, we inherited 5,000 casks of whiskey. We set about recasking most of that, since whiskey is an aging game. You distill now, and then years down the road, you're going to see the revenue for it. So you've got to start making money quickly. We recast whiskeys. We released about 400 to 500 whiskeys over the next 10 years, which really kind of put a stamp on our brand identity. Jim McEwen won Distiller of the Year multiple times, Whiskey Personality of the Year. The distillery won several awards. Even today, there's significant press around the story of this distillery, and specifically around our philosophy. We've had a New Yorker article written up. There's a 60 Minutes piece, and most recently, I saw somebody mention it in the chat. There's a documentary through streaming services. I think it's been on Hulu and Amazon Prime. I'm not sure if it's been on Netflix, but it's great material because it's a great story. And no, I wish I'd had some part in that production. I watched it actually for the first time on a flight to Isla. And it was great because I got to, see the people that I knew at the distillery on the video and really kind of relate to their stories, and then, meet them when I landed and really just kind of chat about, what that was like for them. But this distillery has gone through multiple changes. As I said, 400 or 500 different whiskeys. We released a gin called the Botanist, which has been fantastic for helping kind of keep the lights on. Nice thing about gin, you can distill it one week and then sell it the next. But long story short, these multiple whiskeys have been kind of distilled, if you will, down to what you see here. One distillery with 3 brands. Now these represent, Bruichladdich, the one on the left, that blue bottle, is kind of the house style for us. That is the core DNA, if you will, of Bruichladdich. But these are different levels of peat or smokiness. Now, Bruichladdich, the Bruichladdich brand made at Bruichladdich, is always unpeated. Port Charlotte is our heavily peated whiskey, also made at Bruichladdich. And then Octomore, which is the world's most heavily peated, makes up about 10% of what we produce. Again, is also made at Bruichladdich. So those are the 3 brands that everything sort of now falls under at the distillery. Now, over the pandemic, a lot has been going on. Of course, everything shut down very quickly on Isla. We basically kind of repurposed the distillery for about 3 months to produce hand sanitizer, much like all the other distilleries in our portfolio here at Remy Cointreau, which is the parent company of Bruichladdich. But we focused on a lot of kind of new initiatives focus on sustainability and on transparency. For those who know, there's something called a B Corp, which is a certification for businesses. It was set up in 2006 that meet the highest standards of verified social and environmental transparency, legal accountability, basically balancing profit and purpose. One of the most well-known B Corps is Patagonia, because their business model is set on, of course, revenue, but generating revenue in the most responsible way possible while giving back to the environment. Bruichladdich is one of only 6 distilleries globally that's achieved that status now. Some make vodka and rum. There's a couple for limoncello and gin. We're the only whiskey and gin distillery in Europe to meet the standards, which are very stringent, to be called a B Corp. And actually, the only other whiskey distillery is actually in the U.S. called Headframe Spirits. So that was huge for us. That was announced in May. And then most recently and most excitingly is the No Hidden Measures campaign, or the Know What's in Your Whiskey. Now, the interesting thing about this is, we're going to talk a bit about it when we get more into the kind of the nerdy stuff of whiskey. There's a lot of laws about Scotch. It has to be distilled in Scotland, has to be minimum 3 years of age, has to be all distilled at one distillery to be called single malt. But there's no rules on where you buy your barley from, just that it has to be made from barley. And there's very specific rules on the age statements. If you're going to put an age statement on your bottle, then it has to reflect the youngest whiskey in that bottle. So most people don't know this, or many people don't know this. If you have a 12-year-old single malt, odds are that there's older whiskeys in there. Yeah, it's what's called a vatting. It's still a single malt, but it has multiple whiskeys of different ages from the same distillery to kind of hit this flavor profile. But if you're going to have a 12 on it, then 12 years is the youngest whiskey that you're going to see in that vatting. Now, at Bruichladdich, we're not so much focused on the age as we are, focused on the flavors, and the flavors coming from the raw ingredients, from the barley. So you'll see our whiskeys come in a little bit younger. The Classic Laddie, for instance, which we're going to be talking about in a moment, is 6 to 12 years roughly. But because we're kind of aiming for this dialed in flavor profile, and we're not using any of these homogenizing kind of processes like the chill filtration, like the caramel coloring, or the computers that hit that same recipe every time. Our focus on this is on the barley, and barley is an agricultural product like anything else. Harvest to harvest, year to year, it's going to change in flavors and yield, and that's a good thing. That's something we're looking for in the restaurants, that whole kind of farm to table approach back when we all ate in restaurants. And we're looking at that with wine, with our beers. People want to know, what are the hops? Where do the hops come from? Is it farmed organically? Where's the barley coming from? Why is whiskey any different? This focus, again, has always been on the casks. 60 to 80% of the flavor comes from the barrels. Why is that? Well, the longer you leave your whiskey in a barrel, the more it's going to taste like the barrel. And if you're using cheap raw ingredients, as I mentioned, just has to be made from barley. So a lot of distilleries will pull barley from Russia, Czech Republic, India. These are the largest barley producers in the world. And it's basically commoditized. This barley is being bred for yield and not for flavor. So if you're buying cheap barley and your whiskey is young, it's going to taste like cheap whiskey. So you need to put it in nice, good wood, whether that's American oak, or refilled bourbon barrels or wine casks, very popular sherry casks. You need that to kind of take the edge off hot alcohol and to really kind of, give that whiskey the elegant kind of finish. Now, with our focus on the raw ingredients, kind of this ground up approach, we're only using Scottish barley. In our opinion, if it's Scotch whiskey, you have to be using Scottish barley. You can't have French wine with Italian grapes. It doesn't work that way. So why should it be any difference with Scotch whiskey? So we're committed to that from the ground up. 100% Scottish whiskey. Scottish barley. We've actually started working with local farmers on the island. We've brought back this cottage industry of growing barley on Isla, as the locals really couldn't keep up with the commodity market. We started paying premiums on market price, paying based on what was planted as opposed to what was harvested. We put the name of the farmers on the bottle so everyone knows where that whiskey comes from. And that whiskey ends up being, like a wine, a single vintage whiskey, and sometimes single estate if it all comes from one farm. So now about 40% of our grain is actually grown locally on Isla. And as I mentioned, small island. This is all coming from within a 10 to 15-mile radius of the distillery. And the Scottish barley is grown on the highlands. So if you taste one of our Scottish barley whiskeys next to our Isla barley whiskeys, you're going to taste this huge variance in flavor that's essentially tied to where that barley is grown, the provenance or the terroir. So for us to hit this dialed in flavor profile using inconsistent ingredients and without computers, it's a very intense vatting process. We've got about 230 cask types available to us, but transparency becomes very difficult. But in our mind, it's incredibly important. You should know what's in your whiskey, not just the minimum age, but everything that's in it. So we launched this campaign where we've essentially taken every batch of our classic Lottie, our core bottling, and we have uploaded as much information as we are legally allowed to give you online. So when you buy a bottle and you bring it home, on the back of that, there is a batch code right here. And if you can, I can switch the screen over, I can show you where online this is. All right, so you should be seeing a new screen here. This is on our website, the No Hidden Measures campaign. If you scroll down and you get this code right here, you enter the code. The bottle I'm holding is 19, which is the year it was bottled, and the batch number is 039. And you plug that in, and everything that we are legally allowed to tell you about that whiskey pops up. Now you'll see there's some redaction there. That's those are whiskeys that are older than the youngest year, which is 2011 here. But you'll see where the barley is grown, whether it's organic, the cask type, second fill bourbon, first fill bourbon. You've got some wine casks in here, some Tempranillo, some Muscat, some French fortified wines, tons of different stuff to kind of hit that, again, that dialed in flavor profile. But if you just bought a whiskey that had an age statement on it, you wouldn't know any of this stuff. I mean, if just a number, just all you have is an age on there. And age is really no indication of quality. Age is an indication of flavor. Again, the older the age, the more barrel influence there is. So our focus is on the grain and using the casks to kind of balance out the flavors of the grain. But then to focus on wine casks, you can bring a lot of fruit in there. Ends up being a fantastic whiskey, but it's going to change year to year. The flavor, that's Adam Hannett, our head distiller's job to kind of hit that dialed in flavor profile. But there's always going to be a little tiny bit of variance. And God bless you if you can find the difference between one batch to the next. Personally, I can't. But really all of these whiskeys that we produce should be and are aimed to be like conversational pieces. These are whiskeys that you want to sit down with friends, family, taste together and talk about the flavors you're pulling out of that. So that's our Know What's in Your Whiskey campaign, or No Hidden Measures. This is kind of super progressive stuff for whiskey. There's really no other distillery doing this other than Compass Box is doing something like this. But a fantastic kind of way of really getting to know what's in your Scotch. Let me head back to my PowerPoint, which I think is this one here.
Hey, Jason, while you're opening up
Sure.
your PowerPoint back up, we do have a question on Facebook.
Sure.
Somebody is wondering, which product of yours would you recommend for somebody who's new to Scotch?
It's a great question. I would recommend the Classic Lottie, which is, again, our house style, unpeated. And we'll talk about the flavor. Actually, now's a great time to talk about it. The focus is on the malt, so you're going to get that kind of nice sweetness up front. A little grassy, a little bit green to it, a big kind of brown sugar body, but a great crowd pleaser. If you're looking to get into peated Scotch, which is, I think what most people think of when they think of Scotch whiskey, even though about 10% of Scotch is actually peated, I would say Port Charlotte is a great entry point there. But for me personally, getting into Scotch whiskey, I started with the blended stuff. Things like Dewar's or Johnny Walker or Ballantine's. Those are all blended Scotch whiskeys. They're not single malts in that they have single malts from multiple distilleries in them, but they're blended in with neutral grain spirit, which is a highly rectified spirit. Think of it like almost like a form of vodka, basically kind of meant to soften it. That was my foot in the door of Scotch. From, you know, if you want to just kind of get right into it, I would go with Classic Lottie.
Awesome. Thank you, Jason.
Oh, my pleasure. Okay, so moving on. There we go, technology. Okay, so this is the Classic Lottie. This is, as I mentioned, 100% Scottish grown barley. You've got the American and French oak cask, as you saw. There's some Spanish barrels. It's always inconsistent in the source, but consistent in the flavor. This is a multi-vintage. So as I mentioned, 6 to roughly 12 years or so. You are sitting at 100 proof on this, or 50% ABV. It does not drink like it's 50%, which can be dangerous. This drinks like your typical 80 proof, 40%, but having that 100 proof, that extra kind of oomph, gives it more of a backbone. You know, alcohol tends to kind of boost sweeter flavors. So that's where that brown sugar is coming in. Of course, as I mentioned here, you get that green fruit, that kind of malic acid, green apple, pears. But the flavor up front that is most striking for me is citrus. Citrus and vanilla, caramel, toffee, but this kind of sweet, grassy, herbaceous kind of flavor. But just an easy sipper. And really, if you get to know this flavor profile, for us, it's the house style. So all of the other whiskeys that we produce have this at its essentially at its core. So as I mentioned, we've kind of brought this local cottage industry back to life. You've got now 18 farms from the original one farm that was growing for us in 2003, now growing for us. That represents, as I mentioned, about 40% of the barley that we're growing. 230 different types of casks. From the original 5,000 that we purchased that came with the distillery, we're now up to about 70,000 barrels in the distillery. This is a multi-vintage kind of experience, everything from Classic Lottie to our next whiskey, Black Art, are blends of these single malts resting in these casks. Now, Black Art, which is coming soon, is a very interesting whiskey. This is the one whiskey where everything else, we're willing to tell you everything we can about it legally. The Black Art is essentially kind of like the hold my beer moment. This is the whiskey where we tell you nothing. All I know is basically what you know is what's written on the bottle. The only person that knows what casks go in this is Adam Hannett, our new head distiller who took over from Jim McEwen in 2015. And actually, if you've seen the documentary, no spoilers, but that moment is depicted in the documentary on Amazon Prime right now. Now, Black Art was Jim's kind of magnum opus, where he takes carte blanche, do whatever he wants with the barrels that he's been kind of squirreling away over the years. These are the best casks in the warehouse with the best distillates in them that he just watches and takes care of. You know, he talks an awful lot about tending to them like his children, you know, tasting them every so often and deciding when they're ready. And then he blends these together to create Black Art, which is our oldest whiskeys. These are all roughly about 20 or so years old. Jim did the first 4, handed over the reins to Adam Hannett, gave him the recipe for Black Art 5. And as Adam had always been taught by Jim, the trick to making whiskey, or one of the secrets to making whiskey, is to make it your own. Adam promptly threw away the recipe when Jim left and made his own. And that was Black Art 5. We are now into Black Art 8, which represents the last of the or the legacy stocks, if you will, the whiskey that we inherited when we bought the distillery. So this is the oldest stuff we have available. The Black Arts going forward are going to be, you know, roughly 19 or 20 years, as it represents the whiskeys that we started distilling in 2001. But this is kind of a super limited, very high-end whiskeys, delicious stuff. This is now Black Art 8. We're at 26 years old, 45%, which is cask strength for us on this particular, this vintage. And you've got an amazing flavor that comes from casks that you're going to have to suss out for yourself. And as I mentioned, these whiskeys should be experiences, and Black Art for us represents the ultimate experience, because you literally know nothing going into it other than the age and the ABV. And really, it's pulling out flavors and trying to connect them with source material, whether the flavor is coming from the grain. And 26 years in casks, You're not going to get a lot of grain flavor in there. So the flavors are coming from barrels. And half the fun is figuring out what type of casks are in there. So this particular one has got a lot of that kind of pipe tobacco. You've got a lot of American oak influence, in my opinion, which is going to give you that, those kind of baking spice flavors, nutmeg, toffee, vanilla. But if you've had any old Bruichladdich, which has that kind of, light heather, kind of not only aroma, but color to it, floral focused, more kind of like melon flavor to it. If you ever had those classic Bruichladdich from back in the day, this new black art really is kind of the closest to that in style. So fantastic whiskey. This is coming, I believe, just in time for the holiday gifting season. So that should be arriving to the store shortly. Now, I did mention we're going to talk about peat. We're getting into Port Charlotte. As I mentioned, Isla is the land of peaty whiskey, but not many people know what peat actually is. And peat's got kind of a bad reputation with a lot of new or first-time Scotch drinkers. There are brands out there on Isla specifically, and it's a small island. Everyone's friends. The distillers at Laphroaig, for instance, went to high school with the distillers at Bruichladdich. But Laphroaig is well known as being a super peaty kind of punch in the face style whiskey. When you're drinking Laphroaig. And a lot of people, I'm convinced, that say they don't like peated whiskey, well, somebody started them off with Laphroaig. You don't start with Laphroaig. You work your way up to it. And if you're looking for an entry-level whiskey to peat, I would say Port Charlotte is a fantastic place to start because it's super approachable. And of course, in my opinion, it's a great place to end as well. I wouldn't go beyond that unless you're looking to get into Octomore. But peat, as I said earlier, is literally pulled from the ground. It's decaying plant, vegetable matter. It's kind of contained in this anaerobic state. So the oxygen never escapes because it's bound up in this moss, this moss that creates this very dense kind of packed environment, which retains all the carbon. You can see from that picture, as it gets darker and darker, you go deeper, there's more carbon there. So peat is really just organic material, plant matter, maybe some animal matter, in the squirrel or two that maybe fell into the bog. That's on its way to becoming coal or any other type of fossil fuel. It's only 10,000 years in as opposed to say a million years, but it's a fuel source like any other. So the way they do it is they dig out these logs, as you can see there on the bank there. They let them dry in the sun for, the little sun that they get for about 2 to 3 months. And then it burns like any other log or fuel source. So that process in the whiskey production, here I have my cheat sheet here for how you make whiskey. You've got the barley that's harvested, that's brought to the malters. In this case, we're using Baird's malt up in the Highlands. The thing about barley is, which makes it very different than wine. In order to distill, you need to have access to the sugars in there. To create alcohol, you need yeast, which eats sugar and excretes alcohol as a byproduct. And to make whiskey, you start with beer. To make brandy, you start with wine. The nice thing about grapes to make wine is the sugar's already there. You can take a Ziploc bag full of grapes, you can mash it up, put it in the corner of your room, let it sit out for a week or so, and you will make alcohol. You will probably not want to drink it, but that will be alcohol. With barley, the sugar is kind of locked up as starch, as a fuel source for the new plant. So you have to germinate it. Now, much like grade school, you would take a bean and put it in a wet paper towel on the windowsill. That's essentially what we're doing at the malters. We're soaking the barley, we're letting it sprout, germinate. Before it turns into a new plant, you have to stop that germination process. Otherwise, you're going to lose the sugar. So to stop it, you have to dry it out. Now, the traditional way to dry it out is to take those peat bricks and to burn it underneath the barley and dry it out that way. Now, when you do that, of course, the smoke, the phenolic compounds, if you will, the phenols in the smoke get absorbed into the barley. And that flavor will then, translate down into the whiskey once it's fermented and turned into beer and then distilled into whiskey and then aged. The flavor is cut down more and more as you go, but the flavor, that smoke remains. Now, if you're dealing with unpeated whiskey like the classic Lottie, that's just barley that's dried with just hot air. But the peat is that original way, that old-fashioned way of making whiskey, and it's what Isla is known for. Because as I mentioned, Isla was the kind of last holdout for peated whiskey. Now, a lot of people think of Isla as a flavor profile. Isla is the land of smoky whiskey. You've got those old Scotsmen with the bagpipes and the tartans up on the hills with, the smoke rising up from the rising up from the stills over the horizon. Maybe a unicorn and two. There's all this kind of marketing around what this magical land of Isla or Scotland is like, and it's all marketing. Isla is not so much a flavor profile. As I mentioned, it's a community. It's for the most part struggling. There's a lot of kind of economic hardships on Isla. You're either working in whiskey or you're working in whiskey tourism, or that's essentially it. If it was, as Jim McEwen said, if it wasn't for whiskey, Isla would be a bird sanctuary. There's not a lot going on. So for us, we were looking at the Port Charlotte when we relaunched this brand in 2018 as really kind of another statement whiskey. Whereas the classic Lottie is that statement on production and philosophy and integrity in making whiskey. Port Charlotte for us is really is looking at redefining Isla as not so much of a flavor profile, but of a place and a place that's inhabited by people. And people, at the end of the day, make whiskey. And so our whiskey in Port Charlotte is really kind of focused around really kind of shining a light on the fact that in order to be legally called an Isla whiskey, all you need to do is be distilled on Isla. And then if you're a large production or a large company, for the most part, you're outsourcing your aging, you're outsourcing your bottling, and you're not using local Ilex, which is what you're called if you're from Isla, to make that whiskey. So of the 9 distilleries now on Isla, we're very proud to be the largest employer out of those 9. You've got roughly about 200 people working in the whiskey industry as a whole among those 9 distilleries, and roughly half of those work at Bruichladdich. So about 80 to 100 people, depending on the season, are working at the distillery because, again, this is all made by hand. Everything's on the island as much as possible, which makes us the largest private employer on the island outside of the government. And really just is again part of this campaign on not only identifying that our whiskeys are conceived on Isla, but are also distilled, matured, and bottled. And to us, that is what Isla is. It's the people, it's the culture, and it's the whiskey that's made there, not the flavor of smoke or peat. So that being said, we are making heavily peated whiskey. This is Port Charlotte 10, which we released in 2018. Very quickly, it won the top rated single malt of that year from Whiskey Advocate magazine. It was number 4 in the actual broader category of whiskey, which included Japanese and bourbon, really the entire category. It's a fantastic dram. And if you're looking for, as I mentioned, kind of intro to the world of peat, this is not that hits you over the head kind of, Band-Aidy kind of flavor, which, a lot of the Isla whiskeys are known for, which personally I enjoy. I like that flavor. I love the ad campaign behind Lefroy where they say like tastes like a burning hospital. But as I mentioned, it's a very polarizing flavor. Port Charlotte at its core has that crowd pleasing classic Lottie flavor. It's that light, floral, elegant, the flavors you get from these vapors rising up these super tall stills, getting lots of copper contact, which filters out the sulfur, the impure, the funky kind of off-putting flavors. So you get this light and elegant and lean whiskey at its core, but the flavors coming in from the peat are much more of this kind of barbecue, hickory, mesquite, more savory smoke. And it's because it's peat sourced from the highlands as opposed to the lowlands. So peat that's close to the ocean is going to have a lot more seaweed content to it. There's a terroir, a provenance of peat as well. And the lowland peat is going to give you that maritime Band-Aid flavor. For us, sourcing peat in the highland around Baird's, which is where we do our malting, you're going to get more tree and grass content, which is that kind of campfire barbecue smoke. So this is a gorgeous whiskey, impeccably balanced between that core, light, floral, elegant style with that barbecue. It's much more of kind of like a maple syrup as opposed to brown sugar body, maple and kind of like a bacon, as I mentioned, pulled pork, salted pork kind of flavor. It's breakfast whiskey, if you will, maple and bacon. There you go. Um, but lots of fruit in there as well. You've got some French wine casks in there. This is a 10-year-old whiskey, and we are coming in at a peat level of 40 ppm, and that stands for phenol parts per million. If you're a beer drinker and you know IBUs, the same idea. Where you can measure the bitterness of the beer with an IBU, you can measure the peatiness of a whiskey with ppms, and that's always measured in the malt when it's before it's fermented and distilled, so everyone's on an even playing field. And as I mentioned, the phenols are essentially kind of whittled down as you're fermenting and distilling and aging. So 40 ppm puts us at the same level of phenols as Laphroaig. Now, 20 to 30 is your average ppm for an Isla whiskey. Bowmore is a 35 ppm. Laphroaig is 40. So heavily peated is roughly 40 ppm. But as I mentioned, flavor profile, night and day difference from Laphroaig. So great entry level. Again, 50% ABV, full bodied, no chill filtration, which is, gives it much more like a rich, kind of creamy, viscous mouthfeel, if you will, very textured, nothing taken out, nothing added back in, all natural color from the wood. So now we get into the really kind of interesting stuff. Octomore, world's most heavily peated whiskey. Now, Octomore is actually a farm about a mile away from Bruichladdich, where there used to be a distillery there that closed around 1820. It's defunct now. You still see the ruins of the distillery there, but it's run by a gentleman by the name of James Brown. He's about 7 feet tall, probably half Viking, I'm sure. James Brown, we call him the Godfather of Soil. He is from the start, reopening the distillery, was supplying us with water for bringing everything down to bottling proof. Now, as you may or may not know, whiskey is put in a barrel at a high level of alcohol, and then when it's time to be bottled, it's brought down to your desired proof level, whether it's 40%, 46, or 50. You add water until you get it down to that point. Now, again, if you're bottling somewhere else, like say you're bottling outside of Glasgow, you're using source water, whether it's municipal water, whether you're using distilled water or deionized water. Your water comes from the source. And again, if you're a huge production working outside of one of the biggest cities in Scotland, you're probably not using the local artisanal, spring water, which is what we're doing here at Bruichladdich. The water used for distillation all comes from the Bruichladdich River, which flows literally under the distillery, not named after the distillery, but actually named after the town of Bruichladdich. Which is what the distillery is named after. Distillery towns essentially just kind of rise up around the distilleries. So, that's the river is named Bruichladdich after the distillery and after the town. But stuff for bottling proof all comes from Octomore Farm. Now, just another element of that terroir and a great kind of foot in the door for us with our relationship with James, who is another kind of larger than life personality. We had this moment years ago, sitting around a fire and drinking whiskey with James. Jim was there. Duncan, who is the gentleman that basically MacGyvered the distillery back together again. Of course, Mark and Simon, the wine merchants that brought it on. We're drinking scotch around the fire, and as you do in Scotland, you basically open a bottle, you throw the cork in the fire, and nobody leaves until the bottle is gone. So things get interesting. And what they come up with was this kind of what if question. What if we created the world's most heavily peated whiskey, and we did it with the same kind of care and elegance that we put into the classic Lottie? If we make the world's most heavily peated whiskey in these stills that are made to put out a super elegant light floral whiskey, could we pull it off? Could we find this balance between these off the chart numbers and this very beautiful light flavor floral whiskey? So they went to the malters up in Baird's and talked to them about Port Charlotte. How do you get 40 ppm on the dot every time? especially if you're using basically a room full of smoke. It's not an exact science. You just kind of get what you get. But how do they get 40 ppm? And what they found out was that, well, they malt for the highest level of phenols possible. And then they bring it down, much like they do with, bottling, bringing it down to bottling proof to hit that 40% alcohol or 50, as I mentioned. You bring it down with unpeated malt to hit 40 ppm. So this what if moment came about again. We're like, well, has anybody ever distilled with that super heavily peated stuff? And the malters looked at him and said, no, you're crazy. No one would want to use that. It would be undrinkable. It would be too rough, too hot, and way too smoky. And so that's when they ordered a whole batch to be sent to Bruichladdich. They said, you know what, challenge accepted. Let's give it a shot. So the trick here in making Octomore is to focus on smoke and not heat. So you want to peat in a way where you're exposing the barley, you're malting in a way where you're exposing the barley to as much smoke as possible while minimizing the heat. So think of this as a bit like cold smoking a salmon. So in this way, we're able to hit these levels of phenols. Instead of 40 ppm, and we're coming in at 200 ppm, 267. We hit 309.1 is the highest level of phenols that we've released in an Octomore. That was Octomore 8.3. And I have it from Adam now that we've got whiskey coming that is over 400 phenol parts per million, which is literally 10 times the level of Lefroy and the level of Port Charlotte. Now, these read on paper as they'd be undrinkable. They're typically at 5 years old. They're typically cask strength. So in this particular one you're looking at here, 10.3, 61% alcohol and 114 phenol part per million. So on paper, it sounds like it's too young, it's too strong, and it's too peaty. But like the rest of our whiskeys, this is about balance. It's about taking these off the chart numbers and really kind of finding a way to marry them together in a way that it's not overpowering. It's still incredibly rich, incredibly layered. We call this an iron fist and a velvet glove. I call it passive aggressive whiskey. It's definitely an experience, a delicious one. It's my favorite brand that we carry. But it's a phenomenal experience. The smoke is all bound up in the fruit. It's bound up in the alcohol. When you nose this whiskey, you're getting much more of that's kind of salted caramel, the toffee, the vanilla coming from the casks, the malt sweetness, but then not so much smoke. When you go in and you actually taste and you let it kind of coat your palate, that's when you get these layers of flavor, the campfire, the tobacco, cigar box, just finish that goes on and on and on. I joke an awful lot about, a dram of Octomore at night, the next day, you're brushing your teeth, that finish is still going to be there. It just stays with you. So we have these structured in releases. Every year is a new batch of Octomore. They typically come out around this time. We are now on our 11th edition of Octomore, because as I mentioned, peating's not an exact science. So every year is a new level of phenols, a new level of ABV. And in this particular instance, our 10.3, a new vintage of barley. If you see our 0.1 series, 10.1, 11.1, that's essentially our benchmark. That is 100% Scottish barley, typically 5 years, all first fill bourbon barrels. So think of that as the reference Octomore of that year. If you see a 0.3, that's our Isla barley. That's the fun stuff that's grown actually by James Brown, the farmer at Octomore Farm. So an Octomore of Octomore, if you will. This particular 0.3, which you can still find in stores, is it's 1 year's harvest. In this one, it's a 2012 harvest, distilled in 2013. It's 6 years by a day. It's like 5 years and 11 months. So comes in again that basically that 5 year mark, where you're going to get much more barley focus and a lot of that kind of smoke presence in the palate. But to me, it's a very kind of focused phenolic flavor to it. It's if you've had the 0.1, that's in terms of photography, which is actually what I went to school for, it's much more of a matte finish, while this is a high gloss in terms of the flavor. So incredible whiskey. This is all 1 year's harvest, single vintage, actually single field from the Concerto varietal. Again, no one really talks about varietals when you're talking about whiskey, not the way they do with wine. Lots of more of that malic acid, green apple, pear, But of course, oak, smoke, wood smoke flavors, campfire, whiskey that just has a flavor and a finish that goes on and on and on. So 10.3 is still out there. You can find, I'm very surprised to see, this is a highly collectible whiskey. Octomore itself is a very collectible brand, as again, makes up only 10% of what we produce. But the 10.4 was the game changer for us. Probably one of the best Octomores that we've released, because this one breaks all the rules. Not only is it 2 peaty, that's 88 ppm, twice that of Port Charlotte Lefroy. Not only is it high alcohol, 63.5%, or what is that, 100 and, I can't even do the math right now, 127 proof. But this is the youngest whiskey that we've released, and literally the youngest whiskey that legally you can produce and still call it Scotch whiskey. This is a 3-year-old whiskey. And the amount of influence that comes from cask, just 3 years, and not refill bourbon barrels, but actually virgin oak barrels. These are larger casks, Limousin oak, which is a French oak, which is typically used for cognacs and French brandies. These are virgin. They never held any other type of wine, or only, in this case, whiskey, and our whiskey. They pull a lot of flavor very quickly. In 3 years, you're going to get a very dark whiskey without any caramel coloring. You're going to get much more of that kind of French oak flavor, which is kind of banana, papaya, of like that intense wood grain, wood smoke, a little bit of tropical fruit in there as well, but lots of spices, lots of kind of, allspice, nutmeg, cinnamon forward. While the American oak tends to be a little bit broader and more buttery, this is more of that kind of, bready, biscuity, very intense, like a banana bread kind of flavor to it. But of course, very earthy, very peaty, nice kind of dry finish. You're getting that leather and tobacco coming from these heavily peated malts. But at 3 years old, it breaks all the rules. I mean, everything that you would think about whiskey, this kind of defies it. And that in its core is what Octomore is about, is really kind of pushing the boundaries of whiskey and really, making the drinker, the consumer question what they know about whiskey, and then really kind of enjoy the experience of sampling something new and something, innovative. So these are currently out there. I know we talked about 4 whiskeys. We do have 2 more that are coming on the way. The newest additions, 11.1. On the slide there, the taste is left blank. It is much more of that kind of Isla focus, more maritime. You're getting more salt, more brine on that. But I'll let you to figure that out in terms of flavor when this comes to stores shortly. And then we've also got the new 11.3, which is, again, James Brown's locally grown Isla Barley, single farm in this case, release. So these are waiting in the wings. Again, you can still find those 10 releases. That 10.4 specifically is definitely a collector's edition. You should find one of those as soon as you can and squirrel that away. Buy 2, drink one, save the other one. And that's it for me. Nope, sorry. Actually, we got the 10-year coming out too. Another 4th edition of our Octomore 10-year. So that's coming as well. And there you have it. So I guess we can open it up. If there's any questions, we have questions coming in through Facebook, through Zoom. We can fire away.
There have been some questions, and Mark and Patrick have been going back and forth answering some of them already.
Right.
But Mark, if you want to just talk a little bit about inventory for maybe anybody else who didn't ask but is curious.
Sure, I'd be happy to. Yeah, the Classic Latte is carried in all of our locations. That's a full distribution item. The Port Charlotte that you talked about is carried in our 36 spirit specialty locations. That's currently retailing at $64.99. The Classic Latte is actually on sale right now for $49.99, so a great price for that entry level that Jason talked about. I highly recommend that for the person that asked entry level. That's certainly one to go to get into the category with. On the Black Art, we'll have 4 bottles that we'll be releasing shortly to select locations. My guess on that would be Portsmouth Traffic Circle will probably get a bottle. Hooks at Northdown will probably get one, West Lebanon location, and probably Store 50 down in Nashua. They have we have our big spirits glassed in locations back there where we showcase all our high-end spirits, collectible stuff, and these bottles certainly fit into that collection. In the Octomore 10.3, we have 6 bottles floating around out there, and the 10.4, we have 2 bottles left out there floating around. So the code numbers on those are the 10.3 is code number 5320, and the code number is 5405. The 2 bottles left on that one. I can tell you on the 10.4, our Salem location has 1 bottle, and Hooks at Northbound has 1 bottle. But please reach out to the store before you go. We'd hate to have you drive all the way there and have an inventory issue, but give them a call and say, you know, do you have the 10.4 Octomore? I'm really interested in it, and they'll set it aside for you. You can add that to your collection. So be on the lookout for these great bottles out there, great holiday gifts, and look forward to adding them to your collection.
Great. Thank you, Mark. So as we kind of get ready to wrap up, I've got a couple of giveaways to talk to you about. So our passport program for the 90 days promotion, for those of you who are playing along or who want to play along, we are awarding points for every event you attend. So tonight's event, for example, has a code word, and that code word is peated. So if you enter that into the Passport app, which you can find all the details about downloading at 90daysaroundtheworld.com, you'll get points, and those points are going to earn one lucky winner a $2,500 gift card to our stores to win the ultimate home bar. That gift card also comes with some one-on-one time with Mark and Lisa and Chad to build up some amazing spirits and wines for your ultimate home bar. So the other giveaway we have is, so for those of you watching on Facebook, unfortunately, this giveaway that I'm about to mention is only for people who pre-registered for the event tonight. So if you want to be eligible for future giveaways, please pre-register on Eventbrite. If you're only watching on Facebook, we have no way of contacting you if you win. So you have to pre-register if you want to win. So tonight, Jason is going to be giving away 4 prizes. We've got 3 sets of 2 whiskey tumblers. So 3 winners will get 2 tumblers each, and an Isla wool scarf with the Bruichladdich tartan. So Jason, I'm gonna send it back to you to tell people how they can win these cool prizes.
All right, we've got some trivia. All the answers were in my presentation, so if you were listening and taking notes, this should be super easy. So yeah, so first 3 we're gonna do for the whiskey tumblers. These are beautiful glasses that come from the distillery. They're branded. They're not like your classic Glencairn tasting glass. These are much more for, you know, just enjoying with friends, you know, bigger glasses, beautiful, beautiful pieces of glassware. So first question.
Oh, Jason, sorry. Before you get to the question, so just so everybody knows, you have to respond in the Zoom chat. So I'm the moderator of the event tonight, so I see the responses in real time. So the first person who leaves the correct answer is who wins.
So this question, you need 2 answers. 2 years. When was Bruichladdich originally founded, and when was it reopened? What years?
All right.
Winner.
We've got a few responses. Jason, I know you can see them. Do any of these look right to you?
Yeah, Dana nailed it. That's the first one I saw.
Yep, she was first. Great job, Dana. Set of glasses coming your way.
All right. Second question for another set of glasses. What % of barley that we're using is grown on Isla? See, people have been paying attention, but I said, what percentage is grown on Isla? 100% is grown in Scotland, but what percentage is actually grown locally? There we go. James got it. 40% is grown on Isla.
James T, great job.
Okay, for another set of glassware, what is the minimum age to be called Scotch whiskey? Peter nailed
I know this one.
it. Yeah, we got a winner right off the bat.
Peter, great job.
Okay, so last question for a beautiful Isla Bruichladdich tartan scarf, a wool scarf made at the Isla Woolery. How many functioning distilleries are on Isla right now? Everyone is paying attention. Yeah, so yeah, 9 was the answer. And I've got Dana again.
Dana, you made out tonight.
All right. Well, thank you for that. I mean, were there any other questions?
So we got a ton of questions about inventory. So thank you so much to Mark for responding in real time and then answering live so everybody else could know. We had somebody tuning in from Florida wanting to know about product availability down in Florida. So I did a quick Google search and sent him or her, it was a gender neutral name, some stores in the Miami area that have Bruichladdich available. And Jason, lots of comments about how beautiful your presentation is. So kudos. All right. So if there aren't any more questions, I would love to just, quickly thank everybody for joining us tonight and thank Mark again and Jason for joining us. This was a really great event. We had some really great questions. We hope everybody enjoyed the presentation. We hope you'll go get a couple of bottles for yourself so you can, try all the items that Jason shared tonight. And if you're new to Scotch, Jason, can you just remind everybody what you think is a great beginner Scotch?
If you're looking for unpeated, I would say Classic Lottie is a no-brainer. It's kind of like my daily drinker. Especially, I like that one before a meal. To close out the evening, PC10, the Newport Charlotte 10, another just kind of easy, very approachable peated whiskey. And if you're looking for something interesting, then I would definitely go to Ockmore.
Great. Thank you so much, Jason. Thank you, Patrick, for being on the line and helping answer some questions. Everybody who joined us tonight, we hope you had a great time. For those of you who were watching on Facebook and wish that you could have won some of these prizes, please sign up on Eventbrite for future events. It is free to register. We need a way to notify you if you're going to be the winner. So tomorrow night, we've got a little wine tasting happening with St. Michel Wines. They are currently donating some of the proceeds from each bottle sold to Veterans Count here in New Hampshire. So it's a perfect pairing for Veterans Day tomorrow evening. So we hope you will join us tomorrow as well. So thanks, everybody.
Caroline, one thing before you go.
Yeah, Mark.
Somebody's obviously paying attention in our webinar chat. I don't believe that you gave out the code word for tonight.
Oh, the code word is peated. Awesome. So yeah, again, code word for tonight, peated, get 100 points. You'll be 100 points closer to being eligible for the $2,500 gift card. Awesome. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you again tomorrow.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you all.